The rain hadn't started yet, but the marina gate was already locked. I stood on the gravel apron outside Vance Boatworks with my hand still raised toward a keypad that no longer answered to me. For days ago I'd walked through that gate as its owner. Tonight it just blinked back at me, red and indifferent, like it had never known my name. Behind the chain link, past the rows of dry-docked hulls wrapped in blue tarp for the season, the office windows glowed gold. I could see Preston's shape moving behind the glass, phone pressed to his ear, pacing the way he'd paced since he was 9 years old and scared of a test he hadn't studied for. Some things about a son don't change no matter how much of a stranger he becomes. I'd buried Walter on a Tuesday. It was Saturday now, and I still hadn't slept in our bed, because our bed was inside a house I could no longer get into. 41 years I'd spent on this property. I learned to read tide charts before I learned to drive. I'd hauled lines beside Walter through hurricanes that took the roof off the chandlery twice, rebuilt it twice, and never once asked my name go on anything but the paperwork nobody wanted to read. When Preston graduated from his marine business program in Savannah, I'd signed the loan that got him his first boat brokerage. When that failed and Blue Harbor rose in its place, some tech and tourism hybrid he swore would put Darien on the map. I'd signed again. I always signed. That was what a mother did, I told myself. You built the dock so your children could walk further out than you ever had. The side gate rattled. Preston came through it alone, wearing a fleece I didn't recognize, his face doing the thing it did now, a kind of practiced softness that didn't reach anywhere behind his eyes. Mom. He said it like an apology and a warning both. You shouldn't be standing out here. Ashley already told the Hendersons you were staying with her sister this week. It'll look strange if someone drives by. I don't care how it looks, Preston. I want to go inside. You can't. He glanced back at the office, then at me. And for 1 second something flickered, not guilt exactly, more like a boy watching a wave come in that he knew would knock him down and couldn't stop. It's not safe for you right now. The insurance adjusters are all over the place because of Dad's policy. There's paperwork everywhere, dust, mold testing. You don't need that stress. Not this week. Then let me get my clothes. My photographs. Your father's watch is on the dresser. Ashley already packed a bag. It's in the truck. He said it too quickly, the way he used to say I already fed the dog when the dog was still hungry. I stood there in the cooling evening air and felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the funeral, not grief. Which I understood, but a colder thing, unfamiliar, that had no name yet. I looked past him at the house I'd raised him in, at the porch light Walter always left on for the boats coming back late, and some old, foolish part of me still wanted to believe this was kindness wearing a bad disguise. Ashley came out then, holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She had her company voice on, the one she used for marina board meetings, warm at the surface and locked at the root. Nell. I'm so glad you're here, actually, this saves us a trip. She held out the clipboard and a pen with the Blue Harbor logo stamped along its barrel. Walter's life insurance needs an updated beneficiary signature before the underwriters release anything. We didn't want you to have to deal with this on top of everything else, so I had Warren's office draw it up simple. Just sign at the bottom, and you're done thinking about it. Where's Warren? I asked. Warren Okafor had been our attorney for 20 years. He didn't usually send paperwork by way of my daughter-in-law's clipboard. He's swamped, Ashley said smoothly. Estate stuff. You know how it is. She smiled, and the smile didn't move anything above her mouth. It's nothing, Nell. Just a formality so the payout isn't held up in probate. You don't want your grief tangled up in bureaucracy for 6 more months, do you? I looked down at the page. The light was going gray with dusk. And my glasses were still packed somewhere in a bag I hadn't seen. The words swam a little: beneficiary, disbursement, trustee, official-sounding words dressed in the practical, tired language of a woman doing her son a kindness. I had signed 100 documents like this over 4 decades of running a business with Walter. I had never once imagined I needed to fear my own name in my own hand. It's just the insurance, Preston said again, softer now, closer to pleading than comforting. Mom. Please. Just sign it so we can get you settled somewhere warm tonight. I thought of Walter in the ground 3 days, of Preston as a boy sleeping in the crook of my arm on a dry-docked sailboat during a storm. Of all the years I had made myself small so there would be room enough for him to grow. I signed it. Ashley took the clipboard back before the ink had fully set, tucked it under her arm, and said, in the same bright, dead voice, "There. Now, you'll be much more comfortable at Cutlass Creek for a little while. Peace and quiet. No stairs, no marina noise. Preston will drive you, Cutlass Creek," I repeated. The old marsh acreage upriver, the useless swamp lot Walter's grandfather had bought for pennies and never once mentioned without a rueful laugh. "There's nothing out there, Ashley. It's mud and a rotted boathouse, then it'll be restful," she said, already walking back toward the office. Already finished with me, Preston drove me out there himself, the two of us silent in a truck that still smelled like his father's cigars though Walter had quit smoking them years ago. The road narrowed as the town lights fell behind us, swallowed by pine and then by marsh, until there was only fog lifting soft and low off the water on either side, catching the headlights and throwing them back diffuse and ghostly. Neither of us spoke. I watched my son's hands on the wheel, steady, too steady, and wondered when exactly he'd learned to drive towards something he couldn't look at. He stopped the truck at the top of a gravel track and didn't cut the engine. "There's a key under the flower pot by the porch," he said, staring straight ahead. "I'll call you tomorrow. I promise, Mom. This isn't," he stopped himself. "This isn't forever." He was gone before I'd even found the flower pot, taillights dissolving into fog like something that had never really been there. I stood alone on the gravel with my one packed bag, 41 years and 4 days into a life I no longer recognized, and looked up at the boathouse Walter's family had always called worthless. It should have been the same sagging shape I remembered from childhood visits, silvered wood, a collapsed corner, the kind of ruin that made Walter laugh and call it the family shame. But the moonlight coming weak through the fog caught something wrong in the outline. Where the old loading door should have hung crooked on rusted hinges, there was a flat, seamless panel of dark, hardened steel, fitted so precisely into the frame that it looked less like a repair and more like a secret. I stood there a long moment in the cold and the quiet, and for the first time since Tuesday, the grief in my chest made room for something sharper. The cabin at Cutlass Creek still smelled like Walter's pipe tobacco, though he'd quit that habit a decade before the cancer took him. I woke that first morning on a bare mattress with the marsh fog pressed white against the windows, and for one merciful half-second I forgot everything. Then I remembered the gate. The clipboard. My own name in my own hand, signed away to something I still couldn't name. My phone had no bars out there, not unless I stood on the porch and angled it toward the water tower 3 miles off. I drove the truck Walter kept at the cabin, an old Ford that still started on the second try, thank God, into Darien proper, looking for a signal and a cup of coffee that didn't taste like it had been sitting since Tuesday. I found both at a dockside diner called the Sea Biscuit, the kind of place where the waitress calls you hon without knowing your name and means it kindly. I sat at the counter and tried my debit card to cover the bill. Declined. I tried again, thinking it was the machine. The way you do when your mind refuses the plainer explanation. Declined a second time. The waitress, a broad, patient woman named Corinne, told me not to worry about it, on the house for a regular, though I wasn't a regular yet, and I understood then that pity was already finding me before the fax had. I called the bank from the payphone bolted to the diner's back wall, an old relic nobody had bothered to remove. The woman on the line was polite in the flattened, scripted way of someone reading from a screen. My accounts, she said, had been restricted pending a fiduciary review requested by the co-trustee on file. I asked her what co-trustee. She said she wasn't able to disclose additional account holder information over the phone. I asked her whose name was listed as co-trustee. She repeated, with the same gentle, maddening patience, that she wasn't able to disclose that information. I didn't need her to. I already knew. I sat back down at the counter with my coffee going cold in front of me, and above the pass-through window, the small television that had been playing a fishing report all morning cut to the local midday news. I almost didn't look up. It was the words Blue Harbor that caught me, the way your own name catches you in a crowded room. The anchor's voice was even, procedural, the voice reporters use when a story hasn't fully bloomed into scandal yet. State regulators, she said, had opened a preliminary inquiry into Blue Harbor Development Group and its founder, Preston Vance, following irregularities flagged in a routine marina financing audit. A company spokesperson, Ashley, unnamed but unmistakable in my mind, had called the inquiry a misunderstanding tied to a paperwork delay and said Blue Harbor remained, quote, fully confident in its financial position. The segment ran maybe 40 seconds. It felt longer than the whole 4 days since Walter's funeral put together. I thought of Preston at 19, sick with nerves the night before his first solo dock inspection, calling me at 2 in the morning because he couldn't remember if he'd checked the bilge pumps. I thought of him at 44, standing in that fleece jacket, telling me the insurance adjusters needed the house empty. Somewhere between those two boys was a man drowning quietly enough that his own mother hadn't heard the water rising. Corinne refilled my coffee without being asked and nodded at the TV. Whole town's talking about it, she said. Everybody figured Blue Harbor was spending money that wasn't there. Fancy office up on the highway, all that glass. You don't build glass on a marina budget. She said it the way people say things they don't expect to matter to the woman across the counter, and I let her believe it didn't. I drove back out to Cutlass Creek with the radio off, replaying the clipboard, the pen with the company logo stamped into the plastic, the specific, careful phrase Ashley had used. Beneficiary signature. Simple formality. Not once, I realized now, had either of them said the word trustee. Not once had they let that word near me, and a woman who spends 4 decades doing payroll and permits for a family boatyard knows exactly how deliberate that kind of silence is. Walter had put the yard into a trust years back, after his father's estate had nearly split the family in two over a warehouse nobody could agree how to divide. I remembered the broad strokes. Warren had drawn it up at Walter's insistence, something about protecting the yard from exactly this kind of mess, but the details had always been Walter's to keep, the way the tide charts had always been mine. I hadn't thought about trustee status in years. I hadn't needed to. I trusted my husband, and I trusted, foolishly, that trust to outlive him untouched. I tried Warren's office from the cabin's landline that evening, an old rotary thing Walter had refused to throw out. His assistant told me Mr. Okafor was in depositions until Thursday, but when I gave my name, there was a pause on the line just half a second too long before she said she'd have him call as soon as he was able. People don't pause like that over nothing. That night I went through every drawer in the cabin, looking for anything with the trust's language on it, anything with my own name spelled out in black and white. I found tax returns, boat registrations, a stack of Walter's old survey logs gone soft with damp, but nothing about the trust itself. Whatever Preston and Ashley had put in front of me, whatever word they'd hidden behind beneficiary, it wasn't sitting in a filing cabinet where I could simply read my way back to safety. If I wanted the truth, I was going to have to go looking for it the hard way, the way Walter had taught me to read a hull for rot, not by what showed on the surface, but by what gave when you pressed. In the morning, I walked the overgrown path down to the boathouse again, past the blue heron that had claimed the dock pilings as its own, past the smell of pluff mud and low tide. The steel panel was still there in the daylight, plainer and stranger than it had looked in the fog, but off to its side, half swallowed by a stand of wax myrtle, I found something I'd missed the night before, a narrow service door, wood frame, hung with an old iron hasp and a padlock gone the color of rust and river silt. It looked like it belonged to the boathouse Walter's grandfather had built, not to whatever lay behind that hardened panel. I still had the keys Preston had shoved into my hand at the marina gate, the heavy ring he hadn't bothered to look at me while handing over. I hadn't thought to try them on anything. I dug them out of my coat pocket now, my fingers stiff with the morning chill, and worked through them one by one against the old padlock's keyway. The third key caught. It turned. I stood there with the padlock hanging open in my palm, my heart going hard and slow at once, and understood that whatever Walter had built out here, he hadn't built it to keep me out. The hinges didn't scream the way I expected. They gave a low, oiled groan, the kind of sound that told me somebody had kept them greased on a schedule, long after nobody living was supposed to remember this door existed. I pushed it open onto darkness and the smell of cedar and marine varnish, clean and dry, nothing like the mildew stink that clung to the boathouse's collapsed east wall. I found a switch just inside the frame, worn smooth at the edges from a thumb that wasn't mine. The lights came up in stages, not all at once, first a soft amber glow along the baseboards, then a bank of overhead fixtures flickering to life one row at a time, like Walter had wired it to ease your eyes into what you were about to see instead of blinding you with it. I stood in the doorway a long moment before I let myself step through. The space ran twice as deep as the boathouse's ruined shell above ground let on. A long finished room with a poured concrete floor sealed smooth and pale. Nothing like the rotted planking overhead. Along the near wall, up on custom cradles, sat 3 wooden boats I hadn't laid eyes on in years. And one I'd never seen at all. A Chris Craft runabout from the 30s, her mahogany hull rubbed out to a deep, glowing red-brown, brass cleats polished bright enough to catch the light. Beside her, a sleek little hacker craft, the kind Walter used to point out in Marina slips down in Beaufort and go quiet with longing over. And past that, half covered in a canvas tarp, something larger, a classic Elko cruiser, the sort of boat that used to run rum up this coast before either of us was born. I put my hand flat against the Chris Craft's hull, and it was warm, somehow, though the room itself held a steady, climate-controlled chill. Warm the way old wood gets warm under care, under hands that come back to it again and again. 41 years married to that man, and I had never once set foot in this room. I walked the length of it slowly, past a workbench lined with brass fittings sorted into labeled bins, past a rack of hand tools hung by size, every one of them oiled and ready. This wasn't a hiding place thrown together in a panic. This was something Walter had built the way he built everything, patiently, over years, a little at a time, the way you restore a hull plank by plank so you never have to stop sailing while you do it. At the back of the room, tucked behind the Elko, was a second door, this one plain, unmarked, the kind of door you'd walk past in a hardware store storeroom without a second look. It opened onto a narrow office, no bigger than the pilot house of a workboat. A single window, painted black from the outside so no light would ever show through the ruined siding above. A roll-top desk that had come from Walter's father's shop, the one piece of furniture in the whole hidden space I actually recognized. And bolted into the wall behind it, a squat gray cabinet with a keypad instead of a handle. I stood in front of that keypad for a long time. Walter had never been a man for passwords or birthdays as security. He distrusted anything that could be guessed by somebody who knew you well enough to love you. I thought of every number that had ever mattered between us, our wedding date, Preston's birthday, the day we signed the papers on the yard, and dismissed every single one, because Walter would have dismissed them too. Those were the numbers a son might know. A daughter-in-law might coax out of a grieving old woman with a cup of tea and a sympathetic ear. Then I thought of the morning we first came out here as newlyweds, 38 years old and half convinced we'd bought ourselves a swamp full of snakes instead of an investment. I'd taken depth soundings off the old dock with a lead line, the way my father taught me before there was such a thing as sonar for a small operation like ours, and I'd written the numbers down in a survey log Walter kept for years afterward. Half as a joke, half because he was proud of me for doing the work myself instead of hiring it out, 6 digits. The depth in feet at mean low tide, the way I'd logged it that first September morning, chiseled into my memory the way only the beginning of something can be. My fingers weren't as steady as I wanted them to be, punching it in. The keypad held silent a moment after the last digit, long enough that my chest went tight with the fear of having guessed wrong. Then it gave a single soft click, and the cabinet door swung open on its own weight. Inside, everything was arranged the way Walter arranged his tackle box, nothing wasted, nothing out of place. A slim fireproof folder held a stack of papers I recognized immediately as trust documents. Thick with legal language, Warren Okafor's firm letterhead stamped across the top of each page. Beneath that sat a second, thicker folder, unlabeled, bulging with printouts. And on top of both, held down by a brass paperweight shaped like a compass rose, was an envelope with my name on it in Walter's handwriting, the same careful, slightly forward-leaning script he used to leave grocery lists on the kitchen counter. I sat down in his father's chair before I opened it, because some part of me already knew I wouldn't be able to stand through what it said. Nell, it began, no endearment, which was so like him it nearly broke me right there. Walter never dressed things up. If you're reading this, Then I didn't get to say it to your face, and I'm sorrier about that than anything else in my life. He wrote plainly, the way he talked. He'd started noticing things about Preston nearly 3 years back: the new truck their son couldn't have afforded on a startup salary, the vague answers about where Blue Harbor's early investor money had actually gone, the way Preston flinched at any question that got too specific about the books. Walter hadn't wanted to believe it either. He'd told himself it was ambition, growing pains, the ordinary strain of a young man building something too big too fast. But a lifetime spent reading Holes for Rot had taught him where to look for the soft places. And he'd started looking, quietly, without telling me, because he didn't want to hand me that fear before I had to carry it. I moved the yard into an irrevocable trust the year after Preston took his first outside investment, he wrote. You're the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. I made it that way on purpose: no committee, no shared authority, nobody who could talk you out of what you'd need to do if it ever came to this. It can't be undone except by the person who made it, and I'm not able to undo it anymore. That means it's yours the way nothing else in our life together has ever been, only yours. I read that line 3 times. He hadn't just hidden a boat collection out here. He'd built me a wall Preston couldn't climb over, no matter what paper he put in front of me, no matter what he called it or how gently he'd asked me to sign. The letter went on. Walter admitted, in that same flat, unhurried voice, that he'd started keeping his own file on Blue Harbor's finances a little over a year before the diagnosis, using contacts from his old marine surveying days to track invoices, permit filings, anything that crossed a public desk. He wasn't a forensic accountant. He was a boat builder with a healthy suspicion and too much time on his hands during chemo, and he'd done what he could with what he had. I don't know everything, the letter admitted. I know enough to be afraid for you. Preston is drowning in something bigger than either of us understood, and I think when it finally comes due, he's going to reach for whatever's closest, and that's going to be you. I couldn't stop loving him for it. I just couldn't let him take you down with him. There was no dramatic reveal folded into his handwriting, no villain unmasked in a single triumphant paragraph. Just a tired, dying man, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of building a lifeboat he prayed his wife would never need to climb into. I set the letter down and reached for the second folder with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last few minutes, replaced by something steadier and colder. Walter's Blue Harbor file was messier than the trust documents. Printed pages annotated in his own hand, circled figures, question marks scrawled in the margins where the numbers stopped making sense to him. Permit applications for a marina resort expansion, twice the size of anything Blue Harbor had ever built. Investor prospectuses promising private slips, a boutique hotel, a promenade lined with restaurants that didn't exist yet anywhere except in a rendering. And tucked behind those, a set of Army Corps of Engineers filings that Walter had flagged with a yellow sticky note, the ink gone soft with age. I read the filings twice to be sure I understood what I was looking at. Blue Harbor's entire deep-water plan depended on dredging a channel wide enough for yachts to reach the new marina from the main river channel. And the only route the Corps would permit for that dredging ran directly through the navigational easement recorded against Cutlass Creek, an easement Walter had quietly secured in his own name years before Preston ever dreamed up Blue Harbor, an easement that had passed, like everything else out here, into the trust that only I now controlled. Preston didn't just need my silence. He needed my signature on a right-of-way he didn't know existed, buried in acreage he'd mocked as worthless and shipped his own mother off to die on. I sat very still in that narrow office, surrounded by the quiet hum of the climate system and the smell of my husband's careful, patient love, and understood for the first time exactly how much power I was holding. And exactly how little time I had before Preston came looking for it. The sound reached me before I understood what it was: tires grinding over the washed-out gravel a quarter-mile up the marsh road, engine noise carrying strange and flat across still water the way sound does out here when there's no wind to break it up. I shoved the folder back into the cabinet, closed it, and heard the keypad lock reset with its quiet electronic sigh. I didn't have time to think about Walter's letter anymore, or the ache of finding out he'd carried this alone. I had time to climb the stairs, ease the office door shut behind me, and cross the boat bay at something just short of a run. By the time I stepped out of the reinforced door and swung the old service door closed over it. Snapping the rusted padlock through the hasp, I could see the SUV's headlights swinging into the clearing in front of the cabin, throwing long shadows through the wax myrtle. I made myself walk slow going up the path. Slow, and a little unsteady, the way grief actually does make you walk, except now I was choosing it instead of drowning in it. Preston was already out of the car by the time I reached the porch steps, standing with one hand braced on the open door like he needed it to stay upright. Ashley came around the other side more deliberately, a leather portfolio tucked against her hip, her makeup fresh in a way that told me she'd redone it in the car before they pulled in. "The way you touch up your face before walking into a meeting you're dreading, Mom." Preston's voice had none of the smooth reassurance from the gate. It came out thin, almost apologetic. "We need to talk to you about something. It's important. Come on in out of the damp," I said, and meant it to sound like an old woman glad for company, not like a woman who'd spent the last hour learning her husband had spied on their own son out of love. "I'll put on coffee." "We don't have time for coffee, Eleanor." Ashley's voice was different than it had been at the marina gate, sharper at the edges, less rehearsed. She stepped up onto the bottom stair and stopped there, like she didn't trust the porch to hold her weight. Or didn't want to get close enough for me to really look at her. "We need you to sign something. Tonight." She opened the portfolio and held out a stapled document, the kind with a court case number stamped along the top margin and a raised seal in the corner that looked, at a glance, entirely official. "What is it?" "It's a petition," Preston said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. For a fiduciary review of your capacity to manage the trust." I let my hand drift up to my collar, the way I used to when Walter would tell me bad news about the yard's finances, back when that gesture was real instead of theater. "My capacity, it's not what it sounds like," Ashley cut in. "It's a formality. Given everything, the funeral, the stress, the isolation out here, it's honestly a reasonable precaution for a woman your age to have a co-signer on major trust decisions. That's all this is, a co-signer," I repeated, slow, like I was turning the word over and finding it strange in my mouth. "Preston. Obviously." Ashley's smile didn't reach past her lips. "We filed it this morning with the county. If a judge signs off, decisions about the trust assets, any of them, would require his approval alongside yours. It's protective, Nell. For you." I looked past her at Preston, who had his phone out now, thumb working the screen even though I doubted there was more than one bar of signal out here on a good day. He glanced up at me once, and for just a second, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation at all, something closer to a boy watching his mother's face and hating what he was doing to it. Then the phone buzzed in his hand and his whole body went rigid, and whatever that was, it vanished back under the surface. "Everything all right?" I asked him directly. "Fine," he said too fast. "Just, the bank. Following up on some paperwork. The bank examiners are coming Monday," Ashley said, before he could say anything else. And there was an edge of real fear in it now, underneath the practiced calm. "For the marina financing review. It's a formality too, but the board wants everything in order. Trust structure included. If there's any question about who has authority over the Cutlass Creek assets, it complicates things unnecessarily." There it was. Not concern for me. A deadline they were terrified of missing. "I don't understand all this legal business," I said, and let my voice go soft and small, the voice of a woman 4 days past burying her husband, still finding herself in rooms she couldn't remember walking into. "Warren always handled things like this for us. Walter trusted him. Warren doesn't need to be involved." Preston said quickly. Too quickly. "This is a family matter. We can handle it as a family, I just need a little time to think it over." I put my hand on the porch rail like I needed it to stay upright, which wasn't entirely an act. My knees actually did feel thin under me, standing this close to my own son while I lied to his face for the first time in either of our lives. You know how Walter was about paperwork. He always said read it twice, sign it once. I don't have my reading glasses out here. I don't have anybody to look it over with me, Nell. Ashley's patience thinned visibly. This isn't optional in the way you seem to think it is. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to petition the court directly. And a judge is a lot less gentle about this than we're being right now. They'll appoint an independent evaluator. They'll ask about your medication, your memory, whether you're eating, whether you should even be living alone out here in the middle of a marsh with no cell service. Is that really what you want? Strangers deciding whether you're fit to keep your own name on anything. I looked at that stapled paper in her hand and thought about Walter's letter still sitting in the safe below our feet, about the word sole trustee, sole beneficiary, about a man who'd spent his last strength making sure no court in Georgia could ever take this land out of my hands without my say-so. Ashley didn't know what she was threatening. She just knew she needed my signature before Monday, and she was frightened enough to reach for whatever lever she thought might move me. 1 week, I said, and let my voice crack right on cue, though the crack in it wasn't entirely performance either. Give me till next week. I'll talk to somebody. I'll understand it better by then. Please, Preston. I just buried your father. I can't sign my name to something I don't understand. Not 4 days after that, Preston flinched at the mention of Walter, and for a moment I thought he might actually agree out of something real. Ashley got there first. 1 week, she said, snapping the portfolio shut. That's it. We have to have this resolved before the Marina launch gala, and that's non-negotiable. If it's not signed by then, we go to the judge, and this stops being a family conversation. The gala, I said, like the word meant nothing to me, though I'd read the date in Walter's file not an hour before, circled twice in his careful hand. The Blue Harbor launch, Preston said, glancing again at his silent phone. Next Saturday. You're invited, actually. Mom should be there, he added, to Ashley, with something almost pleading in it, like he wanted one part of this to still look like love. Ashley's expression flickered, not warmth, but calculation, deciding a grieving widow at the ribbon cutting might play well for the cameras. Of course. We'll send the details. They didn't stay long after that. Preston hugged me stiffly on the porch, his phone still gripped in one hand like a man holding onto a life preserver, and murmured something about calling to check on me that we both understood he had no intention of doing. Ashley didn't hug me at all. She walked back to the SUV already dialing someone, her heels sinking into the soft ground with every step, and I watched the two of them pull away down the marsh road until their taillights dissolved into the fog rolling off the creek. I stood on the porch a long moment after the engine noise had faded entirely, my heart going hard and slow the way it does after you've held very still through something dangerous. Then I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and thumbed the little recorder app closed, the one I'd started running the second I heard their tires on the gravel, the whole conversation sitting there now in a file labeled with nothing more than the date, 1 week. A gala with a date already circled in my dead husband's handwriting. A young woman terrified enough to threaten an old widow's competency over a bank inspection, and a son too afraid of his own collapse to stop her. I had exactly the amount of time I needed, and not 1 day more. The morning after Preston and Ashley's taillights vanished into the fog, I sat at Walter's roll-top desk with his Blue Harbor file open in front of me and made a list the way he used to before any big yard project. Not a list of feelings. A list of steps. Warren first. Then money. Then the federal contacts Walter's file had only hinted at, buried in a margin note that read, if it comes to this, Warren has the names. Then the gala itself, 7 days out, already circled twice in Walter's hand like he'd known long before I did exactly when this would end. I called Warren Okafor's office again that morning, and this time his assistant didn't make me wait for a callback. Warren himself picked up within the hour, his voice careful in a way that told me he already suspected more than he was saying. Nell. I got your message. I also got a call yesterday from Preston's counsel asking whether my firm had any involvement in trust matters at Cutlass Creek. He let that sit a moment. I told them no, which was true at the time. I'd like it to still be true when I hang up. If you understand me, I need you to represent me directly, I said. Not the estate. Me, as trustee. And I need it done quietly enough that Preston doesn't hear about it until I'm ready for him to. There was a pause, the kind lawyers use to decide how much risk they're willing to carry for a client they respect. Walter set up a blind structure specifically so a request like this could stay off Preston's radar for a while. I can work through a paralegal on this one, keep my name further back in the file than usual. But Nell, If you're building towards something adversarial, I need to know the shape of it before I put my signature on anything, I told him. Not everything, not yet the recording, not yet the gala, but enough. The trusteeship. The dredging rights buried in Walter's file. The forged filing Preston and Ashley had waved at me on my own porch. Warren went quiet for a long stretch after that, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful edge entirely. Walter built you an ironclad trust, Nell. I helped him do it and I still underestimated how far he'd gone. Get me copies of everything in that Blue Harbor file. I'll have the trust's legal standing bulletproofed by the end of the week. That took care of the law. The money took longer. And it took something out of me I hadn't expected it to cost. I'd known about Desmond Hale for as long as I'd known Walter, a quiet, careful man out of Beaufort who'd bought and sold wooden boats with our yard for 30 years without ever once trying to talk Walter down on price. I called him from the Marsh Road, the only spot with reliable signal, and told him I had a hacker craft that needed a home. He drove down himself 2 days later, alone, in an old pickup that looked like it had hauled more lumber than luxury. He walked around the boat in the boathouse bay the way I imagine men walk around cathedrals, running a flat palm along the hull without pressing, the way you touch something you already know you're going to love. Walter kept this from everybody, he said, not quite a question, everybody, I agreed. He didn't ask why I was selling, and I didn't offer. He counted out cash into my hands in a tackle box, no paperwork beyond a bill of sale scrawled on a yellow legal pad, and told me, almost gently, that Walter would have wanted me to get more for her than he was paying. Walter would have wanted me to still have a boatyard by the end of the month, I said. This'll do. Letting that boat go up onto Desmond's trailer felt like closing a door on something Walter had built with his own hands, plank by plank, over a decade of quiet Saturday mornings. But the cash in that tackle box was the only kind of leverage nobody could freeze, subpoena, or trace back to a trust filing before I was ready for them to see it. I stood on the dock and watched the trailer disappear up the Marsh Road, and told myself that grief could wait until after the fight was over. Warren's federal contact came through 3 days before the gala, and true to the plan he'd said he'd take, it wasn't in any office with his name on the door. We met at 4 in the morning on a shrimp boat dock 2 towns over. The kind of place where the only people awake were men loading ice into coolers before a run out to the Sound. The air smelled like diesel and low tide. 2 figures were waiting under the single working dock light when Warren's sedan pulled in, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in a windbreaker with a Coast Guard patch, and a heavy-set man nursing a paper cup of gas station coffee like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Special Agent Marcus Feld, SEC, the man said, shaking my hand without ceremony. This is Lieutenant Commander Ibarra, Coast Guard Investigations. Warren tells us you've got something we've been chasing for the better part of a year. I didn't waste the early hour on pleasantries. I laid Walter's file out across the hood of Warren's car under the dock light, the annotated permits, the inflated investor prospectuses, the Army Corps filings with the easements circled twice in yellow ink. Ibarra went through the navigational documents first, her expression sharpening page by page, while Feld flipped through the financial pages beside her, occasionally letting out a low, disbelieving breath. Blue Harbor's been telling investors they've secured dredging access for 18 months, Ibarra said finally, tapping the core filing. This says the only viable channel runs straight through an easement that was never theirs to promise. If this is accurate, and I've got no reason yet to think it isn't, the entire financing package they're pitching Saturday night is built on a route that doesn't exist without your signature. It's accurate, I said. My husband made sure of that years before Preston ever needed it to be true. Feld set his coffee down on the hood, careful, like he needed both hands free for what he was about to say. We've had an open file on Vance's marina financing since a Coast Guard permit audit flagged discrepancies 8 months back. What we haven't had is anyone willing to hand us paper that connects the missing investor capital directly to a personal offshore account instead of a business shortfall. This does that. This is what our case has been missing. Then you can move, I said. It wasn't a question either. Ibarra and Feld traded a look I recognized from 4 decades of watching Walter negotiate with skeptical harbor inspectors, the look of 2 professionals deciding whether the person in front of them was worth the risk of trusting completely. If this holds up under review, and we don't see why it wouldn't, Feld said. We can have coordinated authority to move by Saturday. But I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Vance. We don't do public spectacles as a matter of course. Quiet, controlled, minimal exposure, that's how these things usually go. He's throwing a gala Saturday night to convince a room full of investors and reporters that this project is real, I said. I'd like your people there when it stops being real in front of all of them, Ibarra almost smiled. You want him to lose it in the room he's trying to win it in. I want it to be the last room he ever tries to win anything in. They didn't promise me a spectacle that morning. Only that they'd review the file and be in touch through Warren by Friday. But I drove back to Cutlass Creek as the sun came up over the marsh with the particular, unfamiliar feeling of having handed my fear to people whose entire job was doing something useful with it. The near miss came 2 days later, and it nearly cost me everything I'd built. Preston called the cabin's landline that afternoon, his voice too casual by half. Mom, quick thing, did Warren Okafor's office reach out to you recently? Ashley mentioned something about a paralegal from his firm requesting old trust filings from the county recorder. Probably nothing, but I wanted to check. My heart went cold and still at once. The particular stillness that comes from 40 years of being the one who stays calm when something on a job site starts to give. Warren's handled Walter's affairs for 20 years, Preston. I imagine there's still paperwork moving through his office that has nothing to do with either of us. I kept my voice light, a little confused, exactly the register I'd used on the porch. Why would that concern you? There was a pause, half a second too long. No reason. Just being careful with everything going on. You know how it is. Another pause. You're still coming Saturday, right? To the gala, wouldn't miss it, I said, and meant it more than he could possibly understand. I called Warren the second I hung up. My hands not quite steady on the receiver. He assured me the request had gone through a general clerk, nothing traceable to his name, and that he'd already had his paralegal switch to requesting documents under a different filing number to cover the trail. It held. But it was close enough that I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself feel until that moment, that Preston's fear was making him dangerous in ways his guilt never had. I spent the days after that the way Walter used to spend the days before a big harbor inspection, not panicking, just working, methodically, until there was nothing left undone that could be done. I drove into Savannah and had a seamstress there put together something plain and dark and well-cut. Nothing like the emerald silk and diamonds I expected Ashley to wear. I stood in front of the shop's narrow mirror afterward and didn't recognize the woman looking back, not because she looked different, but because she looked, for the first time since Walter's funeral, entirely certain of herself. I rehearsed what I'd say at the gala the way I used to rehearse safety briefings before a big pour, out loud, alone, in the boathouse office with Walter's letter still sitting in the biometric cabinet where I'd first found it. Not a speech. Just the facts, in order, the way Walter would have laid them out for a room of engineers who needed to understand exactly why a structure was about to fail. The gala invitation arrived by courier on Thursday morning, a heavy cream card addressed to Eleanor Vance, founding partner, Vance Boatworks, in Ashley's precise hand. A short note was clipped to the front, unmistakably Preston's, 3 lines long. Mom, hope you'll come. Would mean a lot to have you there. I read it twice, standing on the porch with the marsh fog just beginning to lift off the creek, and felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anger either, just a tired, clear-eyed certainty that whatever was left of my son by Saturday night would have to survive on its own, without me standing between him and the consequences he'd built with his own hands. I set the invitation on Walter's desk, beside his letter, and began to plan exactly how I would walk into that room. The marina at dusk looked nothing like the place I'd spent 40 years hauling lines and reading tide charts. Strings of white lights ran the length of the new docks, threading between yachts too polished to have ever actually been fished from. A jazz trio played under a tent big enough to cover half the parking lot, and somewhere past the crowd, a christening bottle hung wrapped in ribbon against the bow of Blue Harbor's flagship rental cruiser, waiting for a moment that was never going to come. I stood at the edge of the gravel lot in my plain dark dress, watching valets in matching polos wave luxury cars toward a makeshift lot. And thought about how much of this glittering scene had been paid for with money that didn't exist yet, borrowed against a channel that would never be dredged. Warren met me by the ticket table, his suit sharper than I'd ever seen him wear, a slim folder tucked under one arm. "Feld and Ibarra are already inside," he murmured, low enough that the woman checking names didn't catch it. "Positioned near the north exit and the caterer's entrance. They'll wait for your signal, and the recording." He handed me a small black remote, no bigger than a garage door opener, wired to a lapel microphone tucked under my collar. "Same system they use for toasts. Once you're near the main speaker stand, this'll override whatever's playing. You'll have the room." I thanked him, and we walked in together, past a check-in table stacked with glossy brochures of a smart marina resort that would never hold water, into a crowd of investors already 3 drinks deep into believing they'd backed a winner. I found Preston near the center of the tent, holding court the way his father used to hold court at boat shows, except Walter's confidence had always come from something real underneath it. Preston's came from panic dressed up as charm. He was mid-story, gesturing toward the illuminated site map pinned to an easel behind him, describing berths and boutique shops that existed only as rendered images. He saw me before I reached him, and something in his face flickered, not quite alarm, more like a man registering a wrong note in a song he'd been humming for days. "Mom." He excused himself from the investors with a practiced laugh and crossed to me, kissing my cheek quickly. "You came, you asked me to." "I did." He glanced past my shoulder, scanning the crowd the way he'd been doing all week, checking for anything that didn't belong. "You look different." "Good. Just different. I had a dress made," I said. Seemed like the occasion called for it. Ashley appeared a moment later in a column of pale silk, champagne in hand, her smile arriving a half-second before her eyes did. "Nell. So glad you made it. Preston was worried you wouldn't feel up to it." She said it kindly enough that a stranger might have believed her. "I feel very up to it," I said. Something in my voice must have snagged, because Preston's gaze sharpened on me for just a moment, the way it had on the phone 2 days earlier. I smiled at him the way I'd smiled at both of them for a week straight, and watched the sharpness fade back into distraction. He had a toast to give. He didn't have room in his head for anything else. The MC called the crowd toward the small raised platform at the head of the dock a few minutes later, and the tent settled into an expectant hush. Preston climbed the steps first, tapping the microphone, thanking the assembled investors for their faith in a vision, in a family name, in a future he described in the same lush, confident language his father used to reserve for well-built hulls. I moved through the crowd while he spoke, unhurried, toward the base of the platform, close enough that the lapel mic Warren had wired me would carry. "Tonight," Preston said, raising a glass, "we don't just launch a marina. We launch a legacy. My father spent his life on this water. I intend to spend mine building on it." It was, I noticed, the first time all week he'd said his father's name in public instead of just mine. I stepped up onto the platform before the applause finished. And the sound briefly stuttered, confused clapping, murmured questions, Preston's smile freezing halfway between pride and alarm as he registered his mother standing beside him at his own microphone. "Mom, this isn't really it'll only take a minute," I said, gently, the way you'd address a boy who didn't yet understand what was coming. Then I pressed the remote in my hand. Ashley's voice came through the speakers before Preston could stop me, cold and precise, the words from Cutlass Creek carried out over the marina in her own exact cadence. "If it's not signed by then, we go to the judge, and this stops being a family conversation. Strangers deciding whether you're fit to keep your own name on anything." The crowd's low chatter died into silence so complete I could hear the halyards clinking against the masts behind us. Preston's face went the color of old canvas. Ashley, somewhere in the crowd, froze with her champagne glass halfway to her lips. "That recording was made 9 days ago," I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "on my own porch at Cutlass Creek, 4 days after I buried my husband. My son and his wife came to threaten me into resigning as trustee of a family estate my late husband left specifically, and irrevocably, in my name. I want you to understand exactly what kind of foundation this project has been built on before a single one of you signs another check tonight." Warren stepped up beside me then, opening his slim folder, and the easement documents he'd filed came out under the string lights for the whole crowd to see, Army Corps stamps, surveyor's marks, Walter's careful annotations from years before Preston had ever needed them. The channel required to bring deep draft vessels into this marina, Warren said, his voice carrying the same flat, devastating clarity he must have used in 100 courtrooms, runs directly through a navigational easement recorded against acreage held solely by Eleanor Vance. Without her consent, this entire resort has no legal water access. It never has. The murmur that rippled through the crowd wasn't confusion anymore. It was the particular, ugly sound of people realizing they'd nearly handed over their money for nothing. Preston found his voice at last, thin and cracking. "Mom, please, whatever you think you understand, there's context, there's a federal investigation," I said, not unkindly, but without stopping. "Into where your investors' capital actually went. Into an offshore venture you funded quietly, using money that was supposed to build docks and clubhouses. Your father found the beginning of it before he passed." I finished what he started. At the edge of the tent, near the caterer's entrance, I saw Agent Feld step forward with 2 other agents in windbreakers, Lieutenant Commander Ibarra moving in from the opposite side with a small Coast Guard escort. The synchronized motion cut through the crowd like a current finding its channel. "Preston Vance," Feld said, his voice carrying without need of a microphone, "we have a federal warrant regarding misappropriation of investor funds and fraudulent representations connected to Blue Harbor Development Group. We need you to come with us." Preston didn't run. He didn't even really resist. He just stood there on the platform his father had once fished off of, watching the last of his charm evaporate off him like morning fog over the marsh, while 2 agents guided him down the steps and past a crowd of people who, 20 minutes earlier, had been laughing at his jokes. He looked back at me once before they reached the parking lot. And for a moment I saw, underneath the panic, the boy who used to call me at 2 in the morning terrified he'd forgotten to check the bilge pumps. I didn't look away. I owed him that much honesty. Even now, Ashley found me a few minutes later, once the champagne toasts had curdled into a scattering of hushed, urgent phone calls and departing headlights. Her mascara had already started to run, though I suspected some of it was practiced. "They're foreclosing," she said, her voice cracked and thin, nothing like the crisp authority she'd used on my porch. "The house. Our house. The bank called an hour ago. The mortgage was cross-collateralized against Blue Harbor's assets, and once the federal freeze hit, Nell. We have nowhere to go." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant the words more plainly than she probably expected. "You have to help us. You have the yard, the trust, everything Walter built. You could fix this in an afternoon if you wanted to." "I could," I agreed. "I'm not going to." She stared at me like the words didn't parse, like a woman hearing a foreign language spoken in a familiar voice. "He's your son." "He is," I said. "And you tried to have me declared unfit so you could keep a house built on stolen money. I'm not interested in rescuing either one of you from a fire you built with your own hands. I am interested in what's left standing when it's done burning." I turned and walked back down the dock, past the abandoned ice sculptures and the unbroken christening bottle still hanging useless against the cruiser's bow, out to where Mia was waiting by my truck, exactly where I'd told her to stay clear of the crowd. She didn't ask me what had happened. She'd have heard it all soon enough, from people less careful with the truth than I intended to be with her. Instead she just climbed into the passenger seat, 15 years old and steadier than either of her parents had been all week, and said, "Grandma, are you okay?" "I will be," I told her, and found that for the first time in 9 days, I believed it. In the weeks that followed, once the dust of subpoenas and foreclosure notices had settled, I sat down with Warren and drew up the papers to convert what remained of the boatyard's uncommitted assets into a scholarship fund in Walter's name, full rides for kids out of Darien and the surrounding counties who wanted to learn boat building and marine trades the honest way, the way Walter had taught himself, plank by plank, patience by patience. I didn't take Preston's calls those first few months. I still haven't decided if that will change. But every other Sunday, Mia climbs into my truck at Cutlass Creek, and we walk the boathouse together, and I teach her the names of the tools her grandfather left behind, one careful lesson at a time, exactly the way somebody once taught me.